The wooden doors of the Holy Redeemer Church had seen many sinners, but they had never seen a scandal like the one huddled in the back pew on a freezing Tuesday night. When the town of Oakhaven woke up, they expected a sermon on morality. Instead, they got a standoff. Silas Vance, a man whose reputation was stained with gunpowder and rumors, walked into the house of God and found something the congregation had ignored: a shivering woman with bruised knuckles and a silk dress ruined by mud. The town wanted to cast her out. Silas loaded his Winchester and offered her a bed. But neither of them knew that the woman sleeping in the pews held a secret that could hang the sheriff and burn Oakhaven to the ground. This wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a declaration of war. The wind howled through the cracks of Oakhaven, a dusty settlement clinging to the edge of the Wyoming Territory, like a tick on a stray dog. It was a town built on silver mines and bad intentions, where the church bell rang just as often for hangings as it did for weddings. Silas Vance pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Holy Redeemer Church, the hinges groaning in protest against the biting wind. He wasn't a man known for his piety. In fact, most folks in Oakhaven crossed the street when they saw his shadow lengthen against the boardwalk. He was a rancher who lived up in the high, jagged peaks of the Dragoon Range, a man of few words and a quick draw, widowed 5 years prior and hardened by the winter of his grief. He had come to town for supplies, flour, coffee, and nails, but the storm had rolled in off the plains faster than a stampede. The livery stable was full, the saloon was overflowing with drunks he had no patience for, and the hotel was booked, a polite way of the clerk saying he didn't want Silas Vance's money. So, Silas sought shelter in the one place that was legally obligated to leave its doors unlocked. He shook the snow from his duster, his spurs chiming softly on the floorboards. The sanctuary was dim, lit only by the dying embers of the pot-belly stove near the altar and the moonlight filtering through the stained glass. The air smelled of beeswax and old hymnals. Silas walked toward the stove to warm his hands when a sound stopped him. It was a soft, ragged intake of breath, a whimper. His hand instinctively hovered over the worn walnut grip of the Colt on his hip. He squinted into the gloom of the back pews. "Who's there?" his voice rasped, rough like gravel crunching under a boot. No answer. Just the shifting of fabric. Silas walked slowly down the aisle, his boots heavy and deliberate. In the last pew, curled into a ball beneath a thin, moth-eaten shawl that belonged to the church donation bin, lay a woman. She was trembling so violently the pew vibrated. Silas struck a match against his thumbnail, the sudden flare of light revealing a face pale as milk, framed by matted dark hair. Her lips were blue with cold, but it was her hands that caught his attention first. They were wrapped in torn strips of petticoat, blood seeping through the white lace. She flinched away from the light, her eyes wide and terrified. They were green, sharp, and intelligent, but currently swimming in panic. "Easy," Silas said, shaking out the match but keeping his distance. "I ain't gonna hurt you." "Go away," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The Reverend. He said I couldn't stay past midnight." Silas frowned, his dark brows knitting together. "Reverend Pendergast turned you out? In a blizzard?" "He said the church is for the righteous, not for the likes of me." She shivered again, a convulsion that racked her entire small frame. Silas looked her over. She was wearing a dress that didn't fit the setting, fine blue silk, now mud-caked and torn at the hem. These were city clothes, expensive clothes. She wasn't a drifter, she was a runaway, and judging by the bruising blooming on her jawline, she was running from a heavy hand. "You stay here, you'll freeze before the sun hits the steeple," Silas stated flatly. "I have nowhere else," she snapped, a flash of defiance cutting through her fear. "Unless you plan to shoot me, leave me be." Silas stared at her for a long moment. He saw the fire in her eyes, a familiar look. It was the look of a trapped animal, deciding whether to bite or die. He unclasped his heavy buffalo hide coat. "I ain't gonna shoot you," Silas grunted. He took the coat off and tossed it over her. The heavy weight of the fur made her gasp. "And I ain't gonna leave you here to turn into an icicle for Pendergast to find in the morning. My wagon is outside. I got a cabin 10 miles up the ridge. It's warm and there's food." She clutched the coat, the warmth instantaneous and overwhelming. "Why?" she asked, suspicion narrowing her eyes. "Men don't do favors for free in this territory." "I ain't asking for nothing," Silas said, turning his back to give her space. "And I ain't a man who cares much for what folks think, especially folks who kick women out into the snow." He waited. For a long minute, the only sound was the wind howling outside, battering the church walls. Then he heard the creak of the pew. "My name is Juliana," she whispered. Silas didn't turn around, but he nodded. "Silas, let's go, Juliana. The horses are getting restless." As they walked out into the biting night, Silas helping her up into the covered wagon, he noticed the curtains of the parsonage next door twitch. Reverend Pendergast was watching. Silas stared directly at the window, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, until the curtain dropped. He climbed up, snapped the reins, and drove the wagon out of town, leaving the judgment of Oakhaven behind. But as they disappeared into the whiteout of the storm, Silas knew one thing for certain. Trouble didn't just knock on his door. He had just invited it in for supper. The journey up to the high ridge was treacherous. The wagon wheels slipped on the icy shale, and the wind threatened to tip the canvas cover into the ravine below. Juliana sat in the back, buried under 3 wool blankets and Silas's coat, her eyes fixed on the broad back of the man driving the team. She had heard stories of Silas Vance. Even in the short time she had been hiding in Oakhaven, his name was whispered like a curse. They said he killed a man over a card game in Abilene. They said he had a temper that could strip paint. They said he was a savage who preferred the company of wolves to people. But the savage had just handed her a canteen of fresh water and hadn't asked her a single question about the blood on her hands. They arrived at the cabin just as the dawn began to bleed grey light over the mountains. It was a sturdy structure, built of thick pine logs, chinked with river mud, sitting in a valley protected from the worst of the wind. A barn stood nearby, and the smell of wood smoke hung in the air. Silas helped her down. She was weak, her legs buckling, but he caught her effortlessly. He didn't linger, didn't make it strange. He just hoisted her up and carried her to the porch, kicking the door open. Inside, the cabin was sparse, but obsessively clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table sat in the center, and a single bed lay in the corner. Books were stacked on the floor, Shakespeare, legal texts, heavy volumes of history. It wasn't the home of a brute. It was the home of a hermit scholar. "Take the bed," Silas commanded, moving to stoke the fire. "Where will you sleep?" Juliana asked, her teeth chattering. "Barn. Got a cot in the tack room. Horses need tending anyway." He made a pot of strong coffee and fried some salt pork and beans in a cast-iron skillet. He set the plate before her, watching as she ate with the ravenous hunger of someone who hadn't seen a meal in days. "Thank you," she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, then catching herself and using the napkin he provided. The slip-in manners revealed more than she intended. She was high-born, trying to act low, but the hunger had stripped the pretense away. "You can stay as long as you need," Silas said, pouring himself a mug of coffee. "But if you stay, you work. I don't carry dead weight." "I can work," Juliana said quickly. "I can cook. I can mending. I can read." Silas chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "Don't need much reading done around here. Can you shoot?" Juliana froze. "Why would I need to shoot?" Silas leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. "Because a woman wearing a dress that costs more than my ranch, hiding in a church with busted knuckles, didn't just trip and fall. Someone is looking for you, Juliana. And when they find you, I need to know if you're going to be behind me loading magazines, or if you're going to be screaming." She set the fork down. The fear returned, sharp and cold. "His name is Mayor Ambrose Sterling." The name hung in the air like smoke. Ambrose Sterling wasn't just a mayor. He was the power broker of the entire territory. He owned the rail lines, the judges, and most of the sheriffs within 100 miles. Silas didn't blink. He took a sip of his coffee. "Sterling resides in Capital City. That's 3 days' ride." "I'm his wife," she whispered. Silas paused, the mug halfway to his mouth. He looked at her young face. She couldn't be more than 22. Sterling was nearing 60. "He's a monster, Silas," she said, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "He beats his servants. He steals land. And 3 nights ago, I found his ledger, the real one. The one that shows he's been selling government rifles to the Apache raiders to destabilize the region so the army will send more funding. Funding he pockets." Silas set the mug down slowly. This wasn't just a domestic dispute. This was treason. "I took it," she said, her voice trembling. "I took the ledger. I ran. I made it to Oak Haven, but his men, they are tracking me. I lost the ledger in the river crossing when my horse spooked, but I know what I saw. He'll kill me to keep me quiet." Silas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley. He had spent 5 years trying to avoid the world, trying to forget the violence of his past. And now, the world had just landed in his kitchen. "You lost the ledger?" Silas asked. "Yes, but I have the key to the safe deposit box in Denver, where the proof of the bank transfers is kept. I sewed it into my corset." Silas turned back to her. "Sterling has a reach like an octopus. If his men are tracking you, they'll check the towns first. Oak Haven is the first stop." "That's why I hid in the church," she said. "I thought sanctuary." "Ain't no sanctuary in a town owned by Silver," Silas muttered. "Pendergast is on the payroll. Everyone is." He walked over to the gun rack on the wall and pulled down a double-barreled shotgun. He broke the breech, checking the shells. "You ain't safe here," Silas said, "but you're safer than you were in that pew." "Why are you helping me?" Juliana asked, standing up. "You know who he is. You know he'll destroy you." Silas looked at her, his eyes hard and grey as the winter sky. 5 years ago, Sterling's land company tried to buy this valley. My wife, Martha, refused to sell. A week later, our barn burned down with her inside. Sheriff ruled it an accident. Juliana gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I couldn't prove it then," Silas said, snapping the shotgun closed. "But if you got the proof of his dirt, well, maybe the Lord does work in mysterious ways." Suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Not one horse. Many. Silas moved instantly, extinguishing the oil lamp and plunging the cabin into grey daylight. He moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutters. 5 riders, Silas counted calmly. Dusters, rifles. They ain't here for coffee. He turned to Juliana. "Get in the cellar, under the rug. Don't make a sound unless the house burns down." "Silas! Go!" he barked. As Juliana scrambled under the heavy bearskin rug and lifted the trap door, Silas positioned himself by the door, the shotgun resting easy in his hands. He watched the riders approach. Leading them was a man Silas knew well. Caleb Thorne, Sterling's head enforcer. A man who enjoyed his work too much. Silas kicked the door open before they could knock, stepping out onto the porch into the freezing wind. The shotgun was leveled at Caleb's chest. "Morning, gentlemen," Silas called out, his voice steady. "You're trespassing?" Caleb reined in his black stallion, a smirk playing on his scarred lips. "Silas Vance. Still playing cowboy up here in the rocks, I see. We're looking for a runaway, Vance. Little thing. Pretty face. Stolen property." "Don't see no property here," Silas said. "Just me and my misery." Caleb leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Reverend Pendergast says he saw a wagon leave the church last night. Says it looked an awful lot like yours. Says he saw a woman get in." "Reverend drinks too much communion wine," Silas deadpanned. Caleb's smile vanished. "We can do this the easy way, or we can burn this shack down with you in it. Hand her over, Silas. Sterling pays well for loyalty. He pays even better for silence." Silas cocked the hammers of the shotgun. The dual click was loud in the crisp air. "You tell Sterling that the only thing he's getting from this mountain is a funeral if you take one more step." Caleb stared at him, weighing the odds. 5 men against 1. But Silas Vance had the high ground and nothing to lose. "Have it your way, Vance," Caleb spat, wheeling his horse around. "We'll be back, and we'll bring a cannon next time." As the riders galloped away, retreating down the trail, Silas didn't lower the gun. He knew this was just the probe. The real attack was coming. He went back inside and stomped on the floorboards. "You can come up." Juliana emerged, pale and shaking. "They're gone?" "For now," Silas said, beginning to pack a saddlebag with ammunition and jerky. "But we can't stay here. They'll block the pass by noon. We have to move." "Where?" Silas looked at her. "There's an old mining tunnel that cuts through the mountain to the other side of the ridge. It collapses a lot, and it's full of rats. But it comes out near the rail line." "We're running?" she asked, disappointment in her voice. "No," Silas said, strapping his holster tight to his thigh. "We're flanking them. You said the key is in Denver. Then we're going to Denver. We're going to get that box, get the papers, and hand them to the U.S. Marshal." "That's suicide," Juliana said. "No, Mum," Silas said, placing a cowboy hat on her head to hide her face. "Sleeping in a church pew, waiting to die is suicide. This is justice." The entrance to the Broken Leg mine was little more than a jagged scar in the side of the mountain, hidden behind a thicket of dead scrub oak and snowdrifts. Silas dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the powder, and guided the horses toward a small, natural overhang about 50 yards away. He moved with a heavy heart. Leaving the animals behind was a risk, but the tunnel was too narrow and the ceilings too low for anything larger than a man to pass. He loosened their cinches, patted the neck of his roan mare, and whispered a promise to return. "If I ain't back in 3 days," he muttered to the beast, "you kick that fence down and find your own way." Juliana stood by the mine entrance, the darkness of the hole seeming to breathe cold, stale air onto her face. She hugged Silas's coat tighter around her frame. The luxury of her previous life, the velvet cushions, the warm hearths of Sterling's mansion, felt like a dream from another century. Here the world was rock, ice, and the man loading a rusty lantern with kerosene. "It's a 3-mile walk," Silas said, striking a match. The flame flared, illuminating his rugged face, highlighting the scars that lined his jaw. "The air is thin, and the timbers are old. We walk single file. I go first. If I stop, you stop. If I tell you to run, you don't look back. You just run. Understand?" "I understand," Juliana said. though her voice wavered. They stepped into the mountain. The silence was immediate and oppressive. The wind outside was cut off, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of their boots on loose shale and the drip, drip, drip of water filtering through the rock. The lantern cast long, dancing shadows that looked like spectres reaching out from the walls. For the first hour, they didn't speak. The tunnel wound downward, following a vein of silver that had dried up 20 years ago. The air grew heavy, smelling of sulphur and rot. "Silas!" Juliana finally broke the silence, her voice echoing strangely. "Why did he kill her?" "Your wife." Silas didn't stop walking, but his shoulders tensed. The lantern swung slightly, the light bobbing. "Martha was stubborn. The land we had it wasn't just grazing land. It controlled the water rights for the lower valley. Sterling wanted to build a dam to divert water to his mines. Martha said no, said the farmers downriver would starve." He stepped over a rotted support beam lying across the path. "Sterling don't like no. He sent men to scare us, cut fences, poisoned a few cows. We held firm. Then came the fire." "I'm sorry," Juliana whispered. "Don't be sorry," Silas growled low. "Be angry. Sorry doesn't load a gun. Anger does." They reached a section where the tunnel narrowed significantly. The ceiling had sagged, held up by timber that looked like wet cardboard. Silas held the lantern high. "Crawl space," he noted. "Keep your head down." As they shimmied through the narrow gap, the earth pressing down on them, Juliana felt a surge of claustrophobic panic. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to control her breathing. Boom! A dull thud reverberated through the rock, shaking dust from the ceiling. Silas froze. "What was that?" Juliana gasped. "Dynamite," Silas said, his voice grim. "They found the entrance. They're blowing the tunnel behind us to seal us in." "They'll kill us." "No," Silas said, moving faster now, grabbing her wrist and pulling her along. "They think the tunnel is a dead end. They're just closing the door. They don't know it comes out the other side. But the shock wave is going to bring this whole mountain down if we don't move." The ground beneath them shuddered. A crack appeared in the ceiling above them, widening with a sickening tearing sound. "Run!" Silas roared. They scrambled through the darkness, the lantern swinging wildly. Behind them, the roar of collapsing rock grew louder, a wave of destruction chasing them through the vein. Juliana stumbled, scraping her knee raw, but Silas yanked her up, half carrying her as they sprinted toward a faint pinprick of light in the distance, the air filled with choking dust. The roar was deafening now, right at their heels. They dove toward the light, bursting out of the tunnel exit, just as the mountain groaned and the exit sealed itself with a massive cloud of debris and boulders. They tumbled down a snowy embankment, rolling over each other until they came to a stop in a snowbank near the rusted tracks of the Iron Horse line. Silas lay on his back, gasping for air, his face grey with dust. Juliana sat up, coughing, checking her limbs. They were alive. "You okay?" Silas wheezed. Juliana looked at the sealed mine entrance, then at Silas. She wiped the dust from her face, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek. She looked less like a mayor's wife and more like a survivor. "I'm angry," she said, echoing his earlier words. Silas looked at her and managed a rare, grim smile. "Good. Keep that. The train comes in an hour." The 4:15 freight train to Denver didn't stop for passengers at the old miners' junction, but it slowed down enough for the brave or the desperate to jump it. Silas and Juliana were both. When the massive steam engine chugged past, belching black smoke into the pristine white sky, Silas spotted an open boxcar door. He ran alongside the moving train, grabbing the iron handle and swinging himself up. He extended a hand down to Juliana, "Jump!" he yelled over the screech of metal on metal. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself toward the moving train, grasping for his hand. Silas caught her forearm, his grip like a vice, and hauled her into the dark, straw-filled car. They collapsed against the wall, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the wheels becoming the heartbeat of their journey. The boxcar was empty, save for some crates of machinery stamped with the logo of Sterling Enterprises. "Irony," Silas muttered, reading the stamp. "We're riding to his execution in his own carriage." The journey was long and bitterly cold. The wind whipped through the open door, chilling them to the bone. They sat huddled together in the corner, sharing the remaining warmth of the buffalo coat. The physical proximity broke down the last of the social barriers between them. They weren't a rancher and a lady anymore. They were just two people trying not to freeze. "What is in the ledger, truly?" Silas asked after a long while. The sun was setting, casting long orange streaks across the plains outside the moving door. Juliana looked at her hands. Names. Dates. But mostly it's the land deeds. Ambrose isn't just selling rifles to the Apache. He's using the raids as an excuse to declare land unsafe and seize it under emergency eminent domain laws. He buys it for pennies, then sells the mineral rights to Eastern investors. He's stealing the entire territory, acre by acre. She looked up at Silas. "He tried to do it to you." "He did do it to me," Silas corrected. "He just burned my world down first." "I never knew," she said softly. "I was a trophy. He married me because my father was a judge in St. Louis. It gave him legitimacy. I spent 3 years smiling at dinner parties while he destroyed lives. When I found the book, I realized the wine I was drinking was bought with blood." "You found a conscience," Silas said. "Most folks never do." "He will kill you, Silas. If we go to Denver, we are walking into the lion's den. He has eyes everywhere. The conductor, the station master, they all take his coin." Silas checked the loads in his Colt for the 10th time. "Then we don't get off at the station." Around midnight, the train began to slow as it approached the outskirts of Denver. The lights of the city glowed on the horizon, a sprawling grid of gas lamps and civilization. It looked peaceful from a distance, but Silas knew better. "We jump before the yard," Silas instructed. "If we ride into the depot, the Pinkertons will be waiting." They prepared to leap again, but suddenly the train lurched violently. The brakes screeched, sparks flying from the wheels. The train didn't just slow, it slammed to a halt. "Trouble!" Silas hissed, pushing Juliana behind a crate. Voices shouted outside. Lantern beams cut through the slats of the boxcar. "Check every car!" a voice bellowed. It was a voice Silas recognized. Caleb Thorne. He had beaten them there. He must have taken fresh horses and ridden the direct pass while they were stuck in the mine. "They're stopping the train to search it," Silas whispered. "We're trapped." "What do we do?" Juliana asked, her eyes wide. Silas looked at the crates of machinery. He pulled a pry bar from his belt, a tool he'd swiped from the mine entrance. "We hide in plain sight." He pried the lid off one of the large crates. It was filled with straw and heavy gears. He frantically pulled the gears out, tossing them into the corner of the car and covering them with loose straw. "Get in," he ordered. "Both of us won't fit," she said. "Get in!" Juliana climbed into the crate. Silas quickly arranged the straw over her, then placed the lid back on, leaving it unnailed, but heavy enough to look sealed. He had no place to hide. The footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. A hand grabbed the edge of the boxcar door and slid it open fully. A lantern was thrust inside. Silas stood in the center of the car, his hands raised, his duster coat open to show he wasn't reaching for his gun. "Well, well," Caleb Thorne said, climbing into the car, followed by 2 deputies holding Winchester rifles. "End of the line, Vance." Tickets were too expensive anyway, Silas drawled. Caleb looked around the empty car. "Where is she?" "She died in the mine," Silas lied smoothly. "Cave in. I barely made it out." Caleb walked up to him and backhanded him across the face. The force split Silas's lip, blood trickling down his chin. Silas didn't flinch. "You're a bad liar, Vance. But it doesn't matter. We'll find her. Take him." The deputies rushed Silas. He didn't fight back. He couldn't risk a stray bullet hitting the crate where Juliana lay. They pistol-whipped him, bringing him to his knees, and shackled his hands behind his back. "Bring him to the warehouse," Caleb ordered. "Sterling wants to skin this buck himself and tear this car apart. If she's hiding in the straw, I want her found." Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. One of the deputies began kicking through the straw piles in the corner. He moved toward the crates. "Leave it," Caleb snapped. "She ain't here. If she was, Vance would have come out shooting. He gave up too easy. She probably froze to death on the ridge." The deputies stopped. They hauled Silas to his feet and dragged him out of the car. As they dragged him away into the night, Silas looked back at the crate one last time, praying Juliana would stay still. He was the bait now, and he had to hope that the housewife from St. Louis had enough grit to finish the mission alone. Juliana waited until the voices had faded and the train began to move again, shunting slowly into the main yard before she pushed the lid off the crate. She was stiff, terrified, and alone. She peeked out of the boxcar. The train had stopped in the industrial district of Denver. Brick factories belched smoke, and the smell of coal was overpowering. She climbed down, her silk dress now indistinguishable from rags. She knew where they would take him. Sterling owned a warehouse near the river, a place he used for sensitive business meetings. She had overheard him mention it once. The foundry. But she couldn't go there. Not yet. Silas had sacrificed himself to give her a chance to get the key to the bank. She navigated the back alleys of Denver, keeping her head down. She looked like a beggar, which was the perfect disguise. She reached the First National Bank just as the morning sun began to gild the marble columns. The bank didn't open for another hour. She huddled in a doorway across the street, watching. 2 men in long coats stood by the entrance, smoking cigarettes. They weren't guards. They were hired guns. Sterling had the bank watched. She felt a surge of hopelessness. She couldn't get in. Even if she did, she'd be apprehended before she could open the box. She needed help. But who? The sheriff was bought. The mayor was her husband. Then she remembered Silas's words. The U.S. Marshal. Marshal Elias Hood was known to be incorruptible, mostly because he was too stubborn to be bribed and too mean to be threatened. His office was 3 blocks away. Juliana ran. She burst into the marshal's office, startling the young clerk at the desk. "I need to see Marshal Hood," she demanded, breathless. "The marshal is having his breakfast, miss. If you have a complaint about a vagrant, tell him Juliana Sterling is here. Tell him I have the Apache ledger." The clerk's eyes went wide. He scrambled into the back room. A moment later, a bear of a man with a white mustache and eyes like flint emerged. He looked her over, noting the bruises, the dirt, and the fire in her eyes. "Mrs. Sterling," Hood grunted, "half the state is looking for you. Your husband says you've been kidnapped by a madman." "My husband is the madman, Marshal, and he has Silas Vance. He's going to kill him." "Silas Vance is a wanted man," Hood said, crossing his arms. "Silas Vance saved my life," she retorted. "I have proof of treason, Marshal. Proof that Ambrose is selling arms to the enemy and stealing land. But the proof is in a safety deposit box, and his men are watching the bank." Hood stared at her for a long, tense moment. He was a good judge of character, and he saw no deception in her face, only desperation. "If you're lying, Mrs. Sterling, I'll arrest you myself." "If I'm lying, I'm dead anyway." Hood grabbed his hat and a double-barreled shotgun from the rack. He turned to his deputies. "Saddle up, boys. We're going to the bank, and then we're going to the foundry." The foundry was a cavernous, empty space that smelled of rust and damp river water. Silas hung by his wrists from a chain hoised over a rafter, his toes barely scraping the floor. His face was a mask of blood and bruises. Ambrose Sterling sat in a velvet armchair that had been brought in specifically for the occasion. He was a man of impeccable grooming, with silver hair and a suit that cost more than Silas's life earnings. He smoked a cigar, watching Silas sway. "Where is she, Mr. Vance?" Ambrose asked politely, as if asking for the time. "Told you," Silas rasped, spitting blood. "She fell. Ravine. Dead." "I don't believe you," Ambrose sighed. He nodded to Caleb Thorne. Caleb stepped forward and delivered a punishing blow to Silas's ribs. Silas groaned, the pain blinding, but he didn't break. "She has the key, doesn't she?" Ambrose mused. "She's going for the box. It's a pity. My men are at the bank. When she arrives, they will bring her here, and I will make you watch while I educate her on the duties of a wife." "You're a small man, Ambrose," Silas wheezed. "Hiding behind money and hired guns." Ambrose stood up, his face reddening. "I built this territory. I brought civilization to this wasteland. If a few savages and dirt farmers have to die to make way for progress, that is the price of history." "It ain't progress," Silas said. "It's just theft." Ambrose pulled a pearl-handled revolver from his jacket. "I'm tired of this. Goodbye, Mr. Vance." He cocked the hammer, aiming at Silas's chest. Crash! The massive sliding doors of the warehouse shattered inward as a heavy wagon rammed through them, splinters flying everywhere. Gunfire erupted immediately. Marshals poured into the warehouse, taking cover behind crates. Marshal Hood stood atop the wagon, shotgun booming. "Drop your weapons, U.S. Marshals!" Sterling's men returned fire, and the warehouse dissolved into chaos. Bullets pinged off the iron girders. Caleb Thorne raised his rifle to shoot Hood, but a shot rang out from the doorway, a precise, sharp crack. Caleb spun around, clutching his shoulder, and fell. Juliana stood in the doorway, a smoking Winchester rifle in her hands, the same rifle she had told Silas she didn't know how to use. She had learned fast. "Ambrose!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the din. Ambrose turned, shock registering on his face. He looked from the marshals to his wife. He saw the tide turning. His men were dropping or surrendering. He grabbed Silas, using the hanging man as a human shield, pressing the revolver to Silas's temple. "Back off!" Ambrose screamed, his composure shattering. "I'll kill him! I swear it!" The shooting stopped. The marshals held their fire. Juliana stepped forward, the rifle leveled at her husband. "Let him down, Ambrose," she said coldly. "You ungrateful wretch," Ambrose spat. "I gave you everything." "You gave me a cage," she said. She reached into her bodice and pulled out a thick envelope. "I went to the bank with the marshal, Ambrose. We opened the box. We have the ledger. We have the letters to the Apache chiefs. It's over." Ambrose's eyes darted around. He was cornered. "That evidence is circumstantial. I own the judges." "Not the federal ones," Marshal Hood called out, stepping closer. "Treason is a hanging offense, Mayor." Ambrose's hand shook. He tightened his grip on the gun against Silas's head. "I'm not going to prison. If I go down, he comes with me." Silas, barely conscious, looked at Juliana. He saw the hesitation in her eyes. She had a shot, but it was risky. "Shoot," Silas whispered. "I can't," she mouthed. "Shoot," Silas roared. summoning the last of his strength to swing his legs up and kick Ambrose in the chest. The impact knocked Ambrose backward just enough to separate them. Ambrose stumbled, his gun firing wildly into the ceiling. Juliana didn't hesitate this time. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck Ambrose in the leg, shattering his knee. He collapsed, screaming, dropping the gun. Marshals swarmed him, pinning him to the dirty floor. Hood moved quickly to cut Silas down. Silas crumpled into the marshal's arms, but his eyes were on Juliana. She dropped the rifle and ran to him, falling to her knees beside him. She took his battered face in her hands, her tears finally falling, mixing with the blood on his skin. "We did it," she sobbed. "We did it." Silas managed a weak grin. "Told you. You could shoot." The gavel fell in the federal courthouse in Denver, with a sound like a coffin nail being driven home. It was a sound that reverberated across the entire Wyoming territory, signaling the end of an era defined by fear and avarice. It had taken 3 grueling months for the wheels of justice to grind Ambrose Sterling into dust. The trial had been the spectacle of the decade, a parade of witnesses ranging from downtrodden farmers to nervous bank clerks, all emboldened by the testimony of one woman. Juliana Sterling, now simply calling herself Juliana Vance in the court transcripts, using her maiden name, had sat in the witness stand with a spine of steel. She recounted the beatings, the hidden ledgers, and the treasonous arms deals with a clarity that left the defense attorney speechless. When the foreman read the verdict, guilty on all counts of treason, conspiracy, and murder, the courtroom didn't erupt in cheers. It fell into a heavy, solemn silence. It was the silence of a people realizing the monster under their bed was finally gone. Ambrose was sentenced to hang by the neck until dead, his execution scheduled for the first thaw of spring. Back in Oak Haven, the impact was immediate and physical, like a fever breaking. The town, once huddled and suspicious under the grey winter sky, seemed to stretch and breathe as the snow began to melt. The corrupt Reverend Pendergast, stripped of his pulpit by a diocese that could no longer ignore the rumors, left town in the middle of the night on a mule, clutching a carpetbag of stolen altar silver. A new sheriff was elected. Tom Miller, a blacksmith with hands like anvils and a reputation for fairness that couldn't be bought with whiskey or gold. For Silas Vance, the victory tasted like ash and iron. But it was a clean taste. He had spent weeks in a Denver hospital, recovering from the beating at the foundry. His ribs had knit back together, though they ached when the barometer dropped, and a jagged white scar now split his left eyebrow, giving his already rugged face a permanent look of skepticism. When he finally rode back into Oak Haven, the town didn't turn away. Men who used to cross the street to avoid him now tipped their hats. The shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson, refused to take his money for a sack of coffee beans. "It's on the house, Mr. Vance," he had said, his eyes wet. "For what you did. For stopping him." Silas, uncomfortable with gratitude, had simply nodded and retreated to the solitude of the high ridge. He wasn't a hero in his own mind. He was just a survivor who had finally fired the last shot. Spring arrived in the Dragoon Mountains with a violent burst of color. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, leaving the valley floor awash in Indian paintbrush and bluebells. The creek, swollen with meltwater, roared a song of renewal. Silas spent his days repairing the neglect of the past few months. He replaced the rotted boards on the porch, mended the corral fences that the winter drifts had pushed over, and cleared the brush away from the plot of land where Martha was buried. One particularly bright Tuesday, Silas stood by Martha's grave. He had made a new cross out of seasoned cedar, carving her name deep into the wood. For 5 years, he had come here to apologize for living when she died, apologize for failing to protect their home. But today, the words caught in his throat. "I finished it, Martha," he whispered to the wind. "The man who took it all, he's gone. The valley is safe." He stood there for a long time, listening to the hawks screeching overhead. For the first time, he didn't feel the crushing weight of the past. He felt a strange, terrifying lightness. It was the feeling of a future opening up, blank and unwritten. The sound of creaking wheels interrupted his reverie. Silas turned, his hand instinctively drifting toward his hip, though he no longer wore the heavy gun belt while working. A wagon was winding its way up the switchback trail. It wasn't the marshal's buggy, nor a supply runner. It was a simple buckboard, pulled by a steady mule. He walked down to the cabin porch, wiping his hands on a rag, and waited. When the wagon pulled up to the gate, the driver set the brake and hopped down. Silas felt his heart give a single, hard thump against his ribs. It was Juliana. But this wasn't the terrified creature he had pulled from the church pew, nor was it the soot-stained warrior of the foundry. This was a woman who had found her footing. She wore a simple dress of yellow calico that matched the wildflowers, and sturdy leather work boots that had seen some miles. Her dark hair was braided back, exposing a face that had lost its gauntness, glowing with health and the high-altitude sun. She tied the mule to the rail and walked up the path, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. Silas stayed on the top step, the distance between them filled with everything they had survived. "Heard you got the deed to the ranch back," Silas said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I did," Juliana replied, shielding her eyes from the sun to look up at him. "The federal government voided all of Ambrose's land seizures. They returned the titles to the original owners yesterday. I wanted to deliver yours personally." She reached into a satchel slung over her shoulder and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it on the railing. "And the rest?" Silas asked. Sterling had a lot of money soaked in blood. "Liquidated," she said, a hard satisfaction in her tone. "Every asset, every account, every stick of furniture in that mansion. It's being put into a trust to repay the farmers he cheated and the families of the miners who died in his unsafe shafts. I made sure of it." "You walked away with nothing?" Silas asked, raising an eyebrow. "I walked away with my life," she corrected him. "And my name." She hesitated then, her confidence faltering for just a second. She reached back into her bag. "Actually, I did keep one thing. I went back to the cabin, or what was left of it." She pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book. The cover was scorched and water-damaged, but the gold lettering was still visible. The complete works of William Shakespeare. "I found this in the rubble," she said softly, holding it out to him. "I remembered you reading it that first night, before the world caught on fire. I thought you might want it back. A piece of the scholar, not the gunman." Silas slowly descended the steps. He took the book, his calloused thumb tracing the damaged spine. It was a relic of the man he used to be before Martha died, before the vengeance consumed him. By bringing it back, she was telling him that man could exist again. "Thank you," he said. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, like the silence between two soldiers who have fought in the same trench. "Where you headed, Juliana?" Silas finally asked, looking past her at the wagon. "Back to St. Louis? I reckon your father would take you back now that the scandal is over." Juliana turned and looked out over the valley. The wind caught loose strands of her hair, blowing them across her face. She took a deep breath of the pine-scented air. "I went back for a week," she admitted, "to settle affairs. But the city, it was loud, Silas. The cobblestones, the carriages, the constant chatter of people who talk but say nothing. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I kept dreaming about the smell of sagebrush and the sound of the wind in the canyon. She turned her intense green eyes back to him. I realized I don't fit in those parlors anymore. I don't want to drink tea and pretend the world is polite. The world isn't polite. It's hard. But up here at least it's honest. Silas watched her. He saw the strength in her shoulders and the resolve in her jaw. She was no longer a runaway. She was a woman who had faced death and chosen life. I heard rumors, she continued, a faint, playful smile touching her lips. Folks in town say there's a stubborn rancher up on the high ridge who's trying to bring a cattle operation back from the dead. They say he needs hands. Someone who can keep the books, cook a meal that isn't burnt beans, and maybe handle a rifle if the wolves come down. Silas looked down at the Shakespeare volume in his hand, then back at the vast, empty horizon of his ranch. It was too much work for one man. It had always been too much work for one man. The pay is terrible, Silas grunted, fighting the smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. The winters are brutal, and the boss, well, he's been known to be a difficult man. Juliana stepped up onto the porch, standing beside him. She looked out at the mountains, her shoulder brushing against his arm. I think I can handle him, she said softly. I've seen him at his worst. I think I'd like to see him at his best. Silas looked at her, really looked at her, and felt the last brick of his self-imposed prison crumble. He extended his hand, not the hand of a savior to a victim, but the hand of a partner. Welcome home, Juliana, he said. She took his hand, her grip warm and firm. Above them, the sun crested the peaks of the Dragoon Range, flooding the valley with golden light, burning away the last of the shadows. The long winter was finally over. Silas and Juliana's story reminds us that true strength isn't about power or money. It's about the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the whole world is against you. They found redemption not in a courtroom, but in the trust they built in the darkest of times. If you enjoyed this gritty tale of Wild West justice and romance, please smash that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. What would you have done in Silas's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next trail.